And hello, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Kegs in Kriegsspiel. I'm about a minute late here or so just because I've been trying to get Tabletop Simulator to work. And the problem with it is I'm on a new computer, and for some reason, it all my modules seem broken. And I don't know if this is because of the computer or if it is a tabletop simulator thing or whatever, but either way, we're having some issues. Let's go ahead and see if I can't get something to load here. And then we can probably use one of these. I think this was one. Let's give this a try and see. Yeah, it looks like it's going to load. So we can just use any module for today's show. And today we're going to talk about reserves. So let me make sure I am configured with the StreamYard and have everything going on. And that way I can talk to you all. And if anybody decides they want to share some pearls of wisdom, we can arrange that too. Getting used to a new system is fun, but also challenging. So anyway, here we are, and we are looking at what appears to be a little map here, and that's probably why it works. And we're just going to spawn in a bunch of pieces here, and let's see here. Well, what we really want, yeah, are these generics. All right, so let's talk about reserves and why reserves are important, why you should have them. And one of the things that you'll notice, and I put this in the event description, is you'll notice that sometimes, or I should say that this particular advice is useful in more situations than just Kriegsspiel. In particular, you'll find it useful when, talking about your finances or whatever else. Now, it's not intended as financial advice, but, you know, um, having savings, having reserves, having energy left at the end of your workday, having anything extra in your pantry, having anything that you could consider a reserve for any situation in life. This metric kind of works for it, which is why I've always said that Kriegsspiel is important because it has real life applications. All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk about it now. Okay, reserves. What are reserves and what is their purpose? Reserves are troops that are initially uncommitted to battle. So let's say you've got a battle going on, and let's just grab some infantry blocks here because it's all we're going to need today. And let's say I've got, and I can't help but I can't just drop blocks on a map. I have to look for a place where they would belong naturally. Um, and let's just put some units out, and we'll copy some of these here. And we will rotate them, and boom, here we are. Okay, so let's say the enemy is defending a position here, and your mission is to attack it. Why do you want reserves? Okay, so you're planning here. You formed up behind this tree line because it's broken terrain, and generally you want to try to advance through broken, or you want the concealment is what you want. You don't want to give the enemy an open field of fire. But in this case, there's going to be a little bit of one, and you're going to push through. But you've decided to maintain a reserve. Now, the question is, why do you have a reserve? Well, the reserve is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, the reserve is important because it allows you to exploit a breakthrough or really any unforeseen or anticipated, like you can foresee it or not, but any kind of an what's the word? A development. That's the word. Any kind of a development that takes place, you want to have a reserve so that you can respond to it. If you don't have a reserve, then you cannot respond to a development. Now, the development could be something that you plan. So, for example, you are planning to hit the enemy with this line, and you're going to dislodge some of his troops. and you want the reserve who will then, push through and exploit the breakthrough, whatever. On the other hand, what if your attack goes in and the attack fails? Let's say it fails miserably. Well, now what do you do? The attack has failed miserably. These units are all broken or shattered. And what are you going to do? And the enemy decides we're going to counterattack with these guys. Well, if they're counterattacking and they're pushing these units back further and further, you need to have a reserve to respond so that you can react to the enemy breakthrough and stop them from pushing. Okay, so that's another way that a development makes reserves important. You could be in a protracted firefight where these units are just all fighting each other, and you need to give these guys on the front a break. They've been fighting, maybe they're low on ammo, maybe they're tired. Okay, so now you're going to rotate a unit in or out or whatever. Maybe there's a lull in the fighting, and these troops need to rest and recuperate. Reserves allow you to do that. So, those are the reasons why reserves are important. They allow you to address developments in the battle. The developments may be foreseen or they may be unforeseen. And specifically, those developments can be things such as to exploit a breakthrough, to defend against an enemy attack or an enemy breakthrough, or to refresh your troops so that your men on the front can have a break and they can rest and resupply, or so on. And then there can be other situations. For example, let's say the enemy begins to flank you. Let's say there's a new development here, and the enemy appears over here. Well, if that happens, you need a reserve so that you can react to it, right? So if the enemy's coming in here, better send some reserve forces over here to blunt or block this attack so that a way your line is not enveloped. So I know that in the Kriegsspiel world, we make a joke about having the longest line. And that joke comes from the fact that a lot of times players do not maintain reserves. They put all of their troops online and they try to barrel through. And absolutely not. You need to always have a reserve so that you can respond. What if your line isn't actually the longest line? What if your opponent has made a long line? And if your opponent has a longer line than you do, he could threaten to envelop you. And if you don't have reserves, you can't respond to that envelopment. On the other hand, let's say he does have a longer line and you have reserves and you have stopped the envelopment. Let's say you've refused the flank here and he cannot outflank you. Now you have reserves and now you can punch through. Now you can break his line up and then you can envelop him and destroy him. So having reserves gives you a lot of power. It makes a lot of things possible that are not normally possible if you do not have a reserve. It gives you options. Okay, how much reserves should you have? Now, there is a difference of opinion in terms of how many blocks players should get in a battle. When you play for fun, generally speaking, um, more blocks tends to be more fun. But I have also learned that you can have fun with fewer blocks. So there is, I'm trying to copy one of these. So there's a difference of opinion. If you're doing this professionally, and your sensitivity is time, you don't have a lot of time to run an event. You don't want to give the players too many blocks. You just want to give them enough blocks to test or evaluate whatever skill or principle or whatever it may be that you are trying to illustrate or teach or test. So you're not going to have them with a whole bunch of blocks because you're not really playing for fun in that case. You're playing for a professional reason. And time is more important than the fun. And therefore, you're going to err on the side of time. And fewer blocks means less time processing a turn because there are fewer variables involved. On the other hand, if you're playing for fun, especially in a play by post, you might give the players a lot of blocks because, well, you're playing for fun. In a play by post, you're not bound by time constraints. So you can, if the turn takes 2 or 3 days to process or a week, the players might not mind. And so give them the extra pieces and let them go at it and have fun. If you're doing a live game, I found that a minimum of 3 pieces, although I've had fun with even just 1 and 2 pieces, but a minimum of about 3 allows them to maintain a reserve. So they put 2 online and 1 in reserve. Usually 4 or 5 or 6 blocks even is typical in most live games. And that should allow you to keep a reserve pretty handily if you have that many blocks. So with as few as 3 blocks, you can maintain a reserve. And with as many as 6 blocks, you can also maintain a reserve. And the only question now is how much should you keep? Well, if you have 3 blocks, you're going to keep, 2 or 3 in reserve, right? I mean, it's pretty simple. There's only a couple permutations that are possible. And that's your answer on that. But let's say you have a lot of blocks. How many should you keep in reserve? The answer to that question is it depends. And what it depends on is the level of uncertainty that you have about what is about to happen next. If you are more uncertain, you will want to keep more reserves. If you are fairly certain you know what is going to happen, you can get away with keeping fewer reserves and you can put more units online. You can even put all the units online and not have a reserve if you are absolutely certain that you know what's going to happen. But I don't think that's an appropriate position for most generals to take, unless you are Mars, the god of war, and you can see the future. You probably always want to maintain at least some kind of a reserve. So based on your level of certainty or uncertainty, you want to maintain a reserve or not. This here cross applies to everything else in life, right? Just like I mentioned, I kind of pledged to you that I would talk about practical applications, right? If you're uncertain what next year will bring, if you're uncertain that you're going to, lose your job or not, or that the economy is going to take a direction one way or the other, if you're not certain, then you want to maintain like, a bigger savings account, right? Think of that as your reserve because you want to be capable of weathering whatever storm comes. If you are certain, on the other hand, what the future holds, then hey, you can spend all but very little of your money and you can, invest the difference or whatever because you're confident that from one year to the next or the next month or the next year, whatever it may be, you're going to be in sound financial ground. So you know what you can rely upon. So and it's the same thing here in Kriegsspiel or anything in life in general. So you want to maintain a reserve, and the bigger your reserve depends on the greater your uncertainty. The more uncertain you are, the bigger the reserve you will want to keep. Now, again, we mentioned how many blocks you have from a gameplay perspective. If you only have a few blocks, if you're really super uncertain, you're going to keep, 2 in reserve and 1 online. If you are pretty sure or kind of so, you at least want to keep 1 in reserve. If you are confident about what's going to happen, you could put all online, but that is a risk. It is a danger because guess what? There are unforeseen consequences. The enemy gets a say in what happens. So, unless the enemy is not getting a say in what happens and you're fairly certain, you should generally try to keep a reserve because, again, surprises happen. And when that happens, you need to be able to respond. And if you don't respond, well, now you're going to lose your initiative. Now the enemy who has a reserve has an advantage against you. And this is true at the tactical, operational, and campaign level, strategic level as well. At all levels of military engagement, this matters. So you want to think about that. All right. So, what do your reserves tell you about your situation? Well, again, same thing with finances, right? If you don't have a savings account, that tells you that your financial situation is dire. It's serious. It's weak. If you have a generous savings account, then your financial situation is pretty stable. It's probably pretty good. And it's the same thing in Kriegsspiel, right? If you have a reserve is a great metric. If you've ever sat there during battle and you've been wondering, Well, I wonder how I'm doing. Am I doing well? Am I doing poorly? How am I doing? Well, if you have a reserve, you're probably doing okay. If it's a healthy reserve, you're doing pretty good, probably. If it is a small reserve, you're probably not doing so great, but you're still in the game. If you have no reserve, you're in trouble. You are in trouble. Even if you're gaining ground and advancing, unless that was the plan all along. And again, you are Mars, the god of war, and you have this, you know, uh, knowledge. Maybe you have superior reconnaissance or intel or something. You have knowledge, and you are certain that you are in a dominant, winning, victorious position, and the enemy is being routed before you. Then you probably want to say, if I don't have a reserve, I might not be doing so good. And that's really, really important because it is a barometer for how you are performing in battle. Whether or not you realize it, if all of your reserves are online, if you've committed everything and the battle is not, I am routing the enemy from the field at this point, or the enemy is not retreating, then you need to be thinking about something else. You need to be thinking about, well, number one, how do I pull units out of the line or get reinforcements up here so I develop a reserve? How do I get a reserve when I don't have a reserve? I need to create one. Why? Why do you need to have a reserve in a situation? Why not put everything online and get maximum firepower against the enemy? Wouldn't that be more efficient? Well, maybe it would be more efficient if you're only looking at it from the firepower perspective, right? Yes, I want as many rifles pointed at the enemy and firing at any given moment. But that's not necessarily the most efficient thing to do in every circumstance, because battle is more complex than the number of rifles that are firing on the enemy and being fired at you in return. It is more complicated than that because there are multiple dimensions. If a battle were just one dimension and it was just about firepower, then yes, you would want to put every musket or every rifle that you have online. But because there is also a maneuver dimension to it, it's literally this three-dimensional battle space, because there's a time dimension to it, because there is a geographic dimension to it, right? You have elevation and terrain heights, you have different kinds of terrains. All of these things inform your decisions, or at least they should. So if you're playing in a complicated situation, where here you see on this map, you have different terrain heights, you have different types of terrain, you have all kinds of geography going on. Yes, if you don't have reserves, then you cannot play in these dimensions. If all you are doing is thinking, well, we're going to put the maximum number of muskets or rifles online, then this is where you're playing. You're playing on this flat terrain here. You're not playing on the map like you should be playing. You're playing over here in this monodimensional battle space where it's really just a numbers game. And if you want to play that, you might as well get a deck of cards and play war with a deck of cards. The highest card wins. Because, a rock, paper, scissors at most complicated, because that's what you're doing. You're just playing a numbers game here. Might as well go do some math problems, do some addition or something, because that's going to be just about as interesting and fun to me. On the other hand, if you're in this battle space, yes, you do need to have a reserve, and your reserve is a barometer for how you're doing. If you don't have a reserve, you need to create a reserve, either by calling for reinforcements or pulling units off the line where and when you can. You might have to retreat a little bit, you might have to give ground and defend a smaller space, a smaller battle space, which will then allow you to put units into reserve. So all of these things are options, but if you don't do any of these things and you have your whole line committed to the battle, then you are unable to respond to any developments, good, bad, or ugly. And then you're in trouble. So you want to have a reserve. Let's say things go poorly for you. and at least you have a reserve. Um, what should you do if you have more reserves, fewer reserves, or none? Well, you want to develop the reserve, and then if you are losing, if things are going badly for you, having a reserve gives you a position to rally on. So you can order them in to fall back, but rally on the reserve. You can order them to fall back behind the reserve. And what that does is that gives these guys a break so that when the enemy hits the reserve, there is at least a turn or two, or there is some space of time where they must fight with the reserve element, which gives these guys time. It either gives them time to get away, or it gives them time to rest and recuperate and rearm, or whatever it may be. This unit might be written off. They are what you call a rear guard, and sometimes your rear guards get overrun. Sometimes they are sacrificed. But if the rear guard, which is your reserve, they're fresh, they have full ammo, they are ready to act as a rear guard, that can allow you to save the army or your greater part of your unit. And so in battle, you certainly want to minimize losses if it's going poorly for you, and this might be the best deal that you can get, but it is an option. And if you don't have reserves, guess what? You don't have the option. And as anybody who knows, when it comes to warfare, especially Napoleonic warfare, when the rout begins, that's when the casualties mount up. The casualties don't mount up when you're trading volleys in line like it shows in the movies. In the movies, you see these two lines march out and they trade volleys in open ground and everybody falls over dead. That is not how it happens in real life. In real life, the casualties really rack up when one side or another breaks and runs, because that's when the cavalry gets sent in. And remember reserves? Look, if you have a cavalry reserve, that allows you to exploit a breakthrough, that allows you to destroy the enemy while he is disorganized and incapable of resistance. And of course, when you kill him or you rout him, when you render the enemy incapable of resistance, well, that's some guy named Clausewitz or whatever, right? Talks about, the entire purpose of the battle is to destroy the enemy's ability to resist. Yeah, that guy, whoever he was saying something about that, right? That's why you want to have the reserve, because if you rout the enemy, but you don't have a reserve that allows you to pursue him, then the enemy will simply reform. Once he's gotten away from you, he will reform and he will attack again. So you have to destroy the enemy's ability to resist. That doesn't always mean you kill them. You can capture them. You can demoralize them. You can take their supplies or whatever. You can destroy, as some people like to do, you destroy their supply line. You destroy their supply train, I should say, burn their wagons as we do. Any of that, you can cut off their line of communication, meaning they cannot receive reinforcements or resupply, whatever. There are different ways you can do it, but you need to do it. And you can't do that if you haven't kept a reserve to respond to that development. On the other hand, if you're on the defense and you have kept a reserve, you might be able to block the enemy reserve, which is coming in to destroy you, or you can at least slow them down. And that is why the reserve matters. Should you always keep a reserve? The question is generally yes, you should always have some kind of reserve, even if it is a tiny reserve, even if it's the smallest formation that you have. Now, again, in Kriegsspiel, because we usually play with these blocks and we're usually working at some sort of an operational level for most of our games. Even at the tactical level, we only give you a minimum number of blocks that we need to kind of play the game. It can be very hard to say, well, I want to have just one battalion out of this brigade to be in reserve, because we don't have a piece for a battalion, even though technically in Kriegsspiel, each block is a half battalion block, right? If you're playing original Kriegsspiel. But when you are playing in the IKS and we're playing at all these different time periods and all of these different scales and so on, you might not have a smaller block. Your smallest block might be a company, which is what I believe these are. So you might just have a company, and that's your smallest block. So you want to keep that in reserve. Now, if the umpire will let you break this block up somehow, or whatever, hey, there you go. You've now got a smaller size reserve, and that's fine. But you want to have a reserve. I don't care if it's one guy with a sniper rifle, whatever it may be. You need to have something as a reserve. Now, you're not going to be able to exploit a breakthrough with this, but this reserve might make a difference on the defense. It could pin down a larger number of troops that are trying to break through. Probably not, but at least you have a one chance in 10 versus no chance at all, right? So you always want to maintain some kind of a reserve, um, unless, again, you're absolutely certain about what's going to happen next. And we've already talked about that. Um, but the answer to the question, should you always keep a reserve, is probably always going to be a yes. It is very rare that you're going to go all in. Now, when would you go all in? If it's an existential conflict and it's basically you're down to your last unit, and you either die fighting or something like that, or it's all over, whatever, I don't know, something like that, then you might commit everything to the battle, but then you're generally going to lose. Even Napoleon at Waterloo, still, I'm certain, had some kind of reserve going on. So don't sneeze. Oh, I'm only human. Anyway, but yeah, you do want to have some kind of a reserve at all times, unless, of course, it's your final battle and you're planning to fight to the death. um, you want to have a reserve, unless you know this is the final time you're going to fight and you know what the end of the battle is going to be. And again, this gets back to uncertainty. This kind of closes that loop. If you're certain about what's going to happen next, maybe you're all going to die fighting, you're all going to be wiped out. It's the Alamo. All right, you don't need to keep a reserve then, because you know maybe the enemy is fighting to the death and you're going to destroy him entirely. Well, you don't need to keep a reserve. You basically know, so you go ahead and commit everything you've got to destroy him. That is a level of certainty, and when you have certainty, then you're good to go. But if you don't have certainty, then you need to keep some kind of reserve, even if it's a smaller reserve than what you would like to have. You want to always try to keep some kind of a reserve. All right, let's take a look here at some comments. Reserves are for cowards, says one of our friends on Facebook. And again, that's a joke, because if you don't have reserves, you're not going to win as much. You're going to lose more. Okay. All right, let's take a look here. Let's see what Aviator has to say. I recently told a friend that's starting a business about reserves, talking more or less about energy. She was exhausted, and I told her to get some rest. Without reserves, how will she be able to? And then it's cut off. But yeah, there you go. Again, these Kriegsspiel lessons cross apply to life in general. If you don't have a reserve, then there are things you can and cannot do. Um, well, I mean, there are things you cannot do, and you want to have that reserve. Should you always keep a reserve? And an emphatic yes from another Facebook friend. Absolutely, you should always have a reserve. And again, unless you are Mars, the god of war, and you are 100% certain, you'd better keep a reserve. Okay? All right. Here's the other end of Aviator's comment: effectively manage your business or make sound decisions. Yeah, that's right. And again, you cannot respond to developments if you do not have a reserve for that purpose. Okay, so it is rare that everything goes the way that you intend it to go in battle. I guess we're going back to that Clausewitz guy again, whoever the heck he was. And if you well, yeah. I mean, as we all know, right? No plan of battle meets first contact with the enemy, or survives first contact with the enemy, or whatever. There you have it. Okay. So if you don't have a reserve, well, your plan of battle had better be perfect. It had better survive that first contact, as well as every other contact with the enemy. Because if it doesn't and you don't have reserves, guess what happens to your plan of battle? Now you're done. You're done for the day. Might as well hang up the hat because it's over. Now, will your plan of battle survive first contact with the enemy? Maybe, but it usually doesn't. Why? Because the enemy gets a say. If you are playing against a euthanized enemy or an etherized enemy that cannot react, well, yeah, of course, it's going to go exactly the way you want because the enemy can't react, or they're reacting in the ways that you tell them they have to react. You're forcing them to react. But the enemy gets a say. And if the enemy has a reserve, for example, then the enemy is going to react in a way, responding to a development, and it's going to react in a way that's going to throw you off. And now that you're thrown off, now that you've lost initiative, now the enemy is in control of the battle, not you. And if you don't have a reserve, you're not going to regain that initiative. You're going to be losing. You're probably going to lose unless you have some sort of overwhelming force or something and you can just sweep the enemy aside. But how often does that happen? And even if you have overwhelming force, there's a little thing called asymmetrical warfare where the enemy becomes partisans or guerrillas or what have you, and they still mess things up for you. And in such a case, you need even more reserves because now you don't know anything. Now your uncertainty is through the roof. So again, no reserves, no certainty. You need to have a lot of reserves. All right. Last comment here. Emmanuel says, fought a battle recently in which reserves saved a good chunk of my division. Absolutely. Look, folks, every military theorist, every experienced military commander in history, the evidence of history, logic. I mean, there are so many things that tell you you need to have a reserve. If you're in a fight and you don't have reserves, you need to make one. And if you can't make one, then you need to be rethinking your battle plan. You probably need to switch to the defensive and a situation where you can create a reserve. And that might mean you have to fall back, tighten up your line, whatever it may be. If your commanding officer is ordering you to attack, 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 and you don't have reserves, you need to send a dispatch to your commanding officer and say, sir, all my units are online and I can no longer respond to any developments, good, bad, or ugly. You need to send reinforcements, or unless this is exactly in line with your battle plan, unless you are certain that this is going to be successful, we need to change the mission. We need to change the plan. So that's it, folks. That's what it means when it comes to reserves. That's why you should have reserves. And also remember what I just tacked on there at the end. If you are a commander or a subordinate, you need to also think about whether the guys on the front have those reserves or whether you, as a commander behind the front, have reserves that you can send in. Because if you don't have reserves, you're in trouble. What do you want me to do? Make them, right? As Napoleon said at Waterloo. Um, and that is an issue. So there you have it. That is my discussion of reserves, and I hope that you can use this advice in your daily life as well as in your Kriegsspiel games, as well as all your other war games. And I hope that it makes a difference for you and helps you play better. I want to thank everybody who participated today. A Facebook user, because that's how you come across on StreamYard. I don't think the integration is 100% for some reason. I think that's a StreamYard thing. But whoever you are, or whoever you were, there may be one or two of you there. I want to thank you for commenting. Aviator, excellent comments. Emmanuel, excellent illustration. And I want to thank you all. And of course, I'm going to give a quick little shout out. Thank you to Otto, because his module loaded the one right way the first time, and I was able to use it to illustrate some concepts for today. So I want to thank you all, and that's all we have. So with that being said, we will see you all on our next adventure. Goodbye for now.